Good afternoon and welcome from Central England to the next session in MEF Connect Cybersecurity, where we're going to be looking specifically at IoT security. Security is always a topic, and particularly IoT security, which appears high up in the agenda of what enterprises tend to be worried and concerned about, but at the same time, we don't know whether they're actually doing very much about it. So I'm delighted to bring together today a panel of experts in the IoT security area, and I would like to welcome them. So first, can I say hello to Nassia Skoulikariti, if I've got your name right. Apologies if I haven't, Nassia.
Hello, Andrew. Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this very important panel. As Andrew mentioned, my name is Nassia Skoulikariti, and I'm the founder and CEO of Apiro Data. I don't know if you want us to do an introduction or we'll wait for it later.
Yeah. Tell us about your organization, Nassia.
Fantastic. So Apiro Data is an end-to-end IoT platform and services company. We enable injection of data, integration of devices, visualization, and analytics.
Thank you. I'd next like to introduce Alistair Elliott of the Pod Group. Hello, Alistair.
Hi there, Andrew. Afternoon. Yeah, thanks for having me on the panel. So yeah, quick intro to me. So I'm Alistair, I'm the CTO networks at Pod Group. So Pod Group, we're an enterprise network operator, really focused on enterprise and IoT connectivity on a global basis from our premises in Europe, US, and Asia. So yeah, delighted to discuss security. It's one of our hot topics here at Pod.
Thank you, Alistair. I'd next like to introduce Niall Strachan of Pelion.
Hi everybody, Neil Strachan. I'm the head of strategy for Pelion. So we are an IoT connectivity provider for OEMs and enterprises, where we also have the connected device platform that is around securing, managing, onboarding devices, and then managing the edge applications that run on top of those pieces of hardware.
Thank you, Niall. Niall. I'd next like to introduce, last but not least, Dawood Ghalaieny of ZARIOT. Hello, Dawood.
Hi, Andrew. Hi, everybody. So I'm the CEO of ZARIOT. What we do is we provide connectivity, enterprise connectivity for IoT devices, where security is a key component of what we do. And in particular, we look at the signaling layer of the mobile networks to ensure that cellular connectivity and all of its flaws are not transposed into the IoT realm.
Thank you. So, a group of experts on IoT security, but I don't think that's the case in the broader ecosystem. Certainly, enterprises, I don't think, are particularly confident when it comes to IoT security. So the first thing I'd like to discuss is, why does IoT security need to appear higher up an enterprise agenda? Nassia, do you want to take that one first?
Sure, why not? So, like you said, IoT and IoT security is something that is extremely important. It hasn't, however, been on the top of the agenda. It has been an afterthought, and there is a good reason for that. A lot of the applications and the use cases and the pilots that have been put out, they've been put out in a way to test. So many enterprises, they did not know what to expect out of the connectivity bit, out of the edge devices bit, or the platform for that matter. So you cannot solve or secure what you don't know. It needs to be solved and secured. So it was a case of an afterthought. Let's put it out there. Let's get it working. Let's prove the concept that actually this type of services are good and they're going to give us the answers that we need and solve the problems that we're looking to solve, and then we'll deal with the rest. However, nobody expected that there's going to be so many devices. We're talking about billions of devices connected to the internet, and security has now become a problem across the board. So it needs to be top of mind. It needs to be something that needs to be addressed from the designing element. And it's extremely important that we look at securing IoT end-to-end, securing IoT on the edge, securing IoT on the connectivity layer, securing IoT on the software layer, and definitely securing IoT on the communication and far end layer. And because it's a vast ecosystem, it's extremely complex, and there is no such thing as one size fits all. So yeah, it has been an afterthought. It needs to become more important. And inherently, I will leave with one last thing, is because enterprises have been paying attention to the IT side of the security, to the network side of the security. When it comes to IoT, is OT and IT. And the operational side of security is something that hasn't been looked at, and it's something that is being done internally, but now needs to expand externally. So when we're talking about securing IoT, we need to look both on the IT and the operations as well.
Thank you, Nassia. I'm going to bring Alistair in next. You're active in the enterprise sector as an enterprise network operator, and we're seeing these forecasts of, well, perhaps 25 billion connected devices by 2030, depending on which analyst source you view. As Nassia said, it brings in many challenges. So what are you seeing with enterprises out there? Does security need to come higher up their agenda?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, we've been in the industry for a fair while now, like 20 odd years. Yeah, and obviously security has become a growing concern. I think, generally, as you look at the landscape, just as across the agenda, across an enterprise and other areas, not just IoT, is becoming increasingly of a hot topic. And I think, as Nassia was saying, you're really, from an enterprise point of view, if you're just new into IoT, you would be coming from perhaps like a prototyping background, and just playing with the IoT as a technology. But as an enterprise becomes to rely on it more and more, and it kind of becomes integral to the overall systems, you've got to really look at it across the board and how you secure it. So from our point of view, we see a large spectrum of customers, those that perhaps just looking for connectivity for their devices, and security isn't really the first thing on their mind. And then other customers who perhaps coming at from a very critical aspect. We've got customers in the US who are coming from the infrastructure space, like critical infrastructure, particularly at the energy sector. And for those customers, it's the forefront of their mind. And what would be great to see is that mindset shifting across the board for all customers, because I think from our perspective, it doesn't really matter what type of device you're doing, what the application is, it is relevant for everybody. Obviously, the criticality of it may be lower for some industries, but I think the importance is still there. So I think you do need to make sure you've got due consideration to it.
Thank you, Alistair. It's certainly very interesting to note, building on the points you both made, that IoT is different to IT, and the enterprise is certainly learning a lot of new things when it comes to IoT. I'm going to bring Dawood in next to ask for his perspective on why security needs to be higher up the enterprise agenda.
I think ultimately, IoT for most organizations is relatively new. So it's a new project, a new initiative. So bringing the element of, or the risk of security becoming an issue into some of these deployments at an early stage, is effectively a risk for the growth of IoT. Because if enterprises start encountering issues, what we're going to end up with is a stop-start kind of approach. Deployments may take longer to come out of POC. There'll be more thought put into security audits. There'll be more thoughts put into, risk assessment. All of that adds additional cost, time, overhead. And at this point, that's not what we need in an industry which has a very, very strong growth trajectory. So the more and more we start to question security or bringing it up as an issue, and if the perception is that, well, maybe IoT is not as secure as it should be, we might end up restricting some of that growth potential. So I think it's really, really essential that it just gets put higher up on the agenda now, so that it doesn't come to bite us further down the line.
Thank you, Dawood. I'd like to ask for Niall's perspective on this issue.
Yeah, I think it will naturally become, higher up in the buying agenda, higher up in the agenda, and not only from what an enterprise wants and needs are, but also the demands that come into it from legislation and organizational governmental bodies, where the concept of actually building secure devices to operate in key regions is now being mandated by governments. So it will naturally be not forced upon people who are building and selling and connecting IoT devices, but it'll be something they have to really think about from the ground up, from the very start of their journey of a project. And that becomes mixing the, how do they secure the device, the data that the device is generating and sending it, ensuring it's over, a secure connectivity if they're transporting the data somewhere, but then also the ability to manage devices at scale. So, if you're looking at tens of thousands to millions of devices on a single deployment, it's understanding, what devices are not secure, which ones are actually more vulnerable to an attack. And when you look at the reasons why the governments are starting to push this, is that with so many large amounts of connected devices inside countries' borders, it opens up the country's ability to suffer a cyber attack as well. So secure by design becoming very, a very prominent factor moving forwards.
Thank you. I'm going to stay with you, Niall, and I'd like to now focus on what we're seeing as the key security challenges and threats right now. And I know that you've got a view in terms of different types of applications, whether they're low, medium, or high security.
Yeah, I think going back into the IoT use cases, there's so many different types of verticals and products and specific slices of a vertical where it focuses on one narrow component of something like a supply chain. And what you see is that all the fundamental factors that are built up into these IoT products have very different characteristics that may lead to a very small, low-power device, or maybe a very, very power-rich gateway that has lots of sensors attached to it. And because of this, you start to see that the hardware that is being utilized can dictate a very different security profile. So something like a small consumer device that may be connecting over Bluetooth have a very, very low amount of power compared to something like that goes into an ATM or something like a point of sale system for transacting money, finances. So the hardware can dictate the security profile and the investment towards that, but then also the vertical that's been sold into. So you can create a low-cost low-cost sensor or a low-cost solution that may be being sold into the banking sector, where they're very, very, very risk averse and very aware of what devices are attaching to networks and communicating into their platforms. So they dictate a very large amount of security procedures that vendors and solutions have to adhere to, which then naturally can increase the cost and then maybe even change what the hardware profile has to be to do that. So the sort of small, medium, high, like small, you would say something like low security risks could be something like a smart metering system, sensing and it's sending data back through to utilities. Medium could be looking at aftermarket insurance telematics solutions, black boxes that can go onto cars. Then a high security would obviously be the actual management of a connected car or like an ATM sort of teller machine that I discussed earlier.
Thanks. I'm going to bring Dawood in next because I think you've got a couple of specific security threats like DDoS and signaling storms that you've been doing a lot of work on recently.
Yeah, I suppose on one level, you have kind of two factors here. One is the enterprise side and what kind of security risks they can expose, and then there's the ones that the mobile network itself can expose. So I suppose just starting with the mobile network, if you look at something as simple as denial of service. Yes, there's the traditional denial of service that we all know about, but then there's also ones where, malicious actors who have easier access now to devices such as IMSI catchers, etc., to effectively kill off an IoT device or fleet of IoT devices, in a particular area. So those types of things are becoming more prevalent. We have seen the availability of IMSI captures, throughout the world, mainly government level, to date, but, there are more, industrial espionage cases that, are occurring. So providing, security for IoT devices, to thwart those threats is kind of very important. So that's, when you look at it from something that the mobile network itself can do and take care of. Then you also have, threats that will come from, the enterprise itself. And, unfortunately, one of the reasons why, we're involved in IoT, or enterprises get involved in IoT, is, to re-engineer business processes, make things more efficient, reduce costs. And cost is a huge, huge driver there. So the devices that, are being used sometimes are, not always the best quality. And, I think if you look at it in the past, there's been a fairly high level of quality attached to, our mobile phones, whereas some of these sensors are very, very cheap. And in order to, get those costs right down, they do compromise significantly on quality. And as a result, we have instances whereby, you'd have a whole fleet of devices that would, reboot at the same time instantaneously, resulting in something like a signaling storm, and, preventing access to devices on the rest of the network. So those are the kind of issues that, are being faced, and, you need a certain level of control, on the network side, to ensure that those threats don't hinder you. So if you have mission critical IoT devices on your network, that you would actually be able to identify those and give them priority in a situation like that, so that they actually can attach to the mobile network. And then the lower priority devices, such as sensors or meters, etc., can reconnect in their own time. So, it gives you an idea of the range of threats that we might occur that mightn't be something that, we would understand in a traditional IP sense.
Thanks, Dawood. I'm going to ask Nassia to come in now, because in your initial question, you talked about end-to-end security. So it'd be good if you could pick up on some of the aspects you were talking about earlier, particularly
Sure.
Cloud, edge, etc.
Fantastic. Yeah. It is important when we're looking at it, at securing IoT, to look at the different aspects, as many of us mentioned already. So to pick on the edge, it is, we're looking at billions of devices. Is it possible to secure all those devices? Maybe not. Do we need to give priority in securing the most critical devices? Absolutely yes. Are firewalling, the be-all of security, especially on connected devices and services? Not at all. If we're still looking to securing a network with just firewalls, that's not good enough. When we look at the edge, for instance, there's billions of devices, and that edge is desperate. So you have it in multiple locations. So a firewall is not going to work. At the same time, what we've seen in the past 1.5 years, that edge is moving. Today is at somebody's house. Tomorrow it's going to be at somebody's office. The next day could be at Starbucks. So what do you really secure? Which edge do you really secure? Do you secure via VPN, just the corporate edge? Do you secure what's happening in a coffee shop that somebody is working on? So it's extremely difficult to secure the edge, and it starts with the hardware. The basic element of securing the edge is at the hardware. As Dawood mentioned earlier, a lot of compromises have been made in order to keep the cost lower. So compromises not only on the quality of the product, but compromises on the security, and security has become as an afterthought. So, and that's why we see a lot of regulation coming into place in securing that edge. And edge, when we're talking about edge, it starts with your personal mobile devices, your wearables, different devices in the household, from controlling the lamps to the doorbell, to tracking your vehicles and pets and so on and so forth. And that's just the consumer side of things, which then becomes enterprise level, because it's an enterprise behind it that controls all the consumer elements. So securing the edge, extremely challenging. Does it need to happen? Yes, it does. What happens after that is many of the cloud leaders have been putting a lot of emphasis, in hyperscale, and they're putting a lot of emphasis in zero trust. So, and a lot of funds have been going into securing their own networks. So what we see is the hardware providers, they're trying to secure their devices because regulation now is mandating that they have to secure their devices. We have the hyperscalers that are trying to secure their points, and everything that's becoming on. On the software side, we need to secure everything that's happening within those applications and other applications. And on the communication side, again, we need to secure that. But where is the collaboration between all of them? Is there any regulation in the connectivity that's happening between the different aspects? At the moment, there isn't. It's just like a nice to have, or let's get together and communicate and make it easy for the end consumer to make sure that what they're buying and what they're using is secure for them. So it's extremely important that the ecosystem creates some sort of a regulatory or self-regulatory body that looks at it the end-to-end security, end-to-end connectivity, and is dealing with the issues that are arising, because it's extremely challenging. And in my point of view, I don't think we're going to solve the problem with one just solution. We cannot, because as I mentioned, the edge is moving, and because of the pandemic, it's going to keep moving, and we don't know what it's going to be. So how can you secure something that you don't know where it's going to be? So it's a lot of challenges there.
Yeah, loads of challenges, and it sounds like it's a very fragmented approach at the moment. I'm going to ask Alistair to come in now. Now, this end-to-end security does seem to be a large issue, and you as an enterprise network operator must be finding particular challenges and threats that your customers are facing or trying to resolve. If you could give me your perspective on those.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really talk about particular customers, but I think if you just look at it from a connectivity angle, because that's the perspective we take, because we're obviously just part of that overall solution. You've got the device on one side and the application it's running, and maybe you've got the IoT platform it's communicating to on the other side. I mean, certainly from our perspective, is trying to keep a very holistic view of that end-to-end security. And obviously, we can do as much as we can in that piece in the middle, but I think you really need to look at very holistically at how do you secure it from end to end. So from the connectivity side, obviously we can try and secure our pieces as much as possible. And it may seem very simple, and I know Nassia, you were saying like a file may not be enough, but in the very essence of it, really, if we're providing connectivity to a device, just taking that communication off the internet, making it appear invisible to the outside world is probably the most fundamental step that you can take. If that device isn't accessible or isn't there, then it really does sort of shorten the security vulnerabilities that may be accessible from that device. But then taking it one step further, really sort of segmenting that connectivity into different applications, it really does mean you can segregate the application that you're using from other traffic, and then maybe keeping things very compartmentalized means the issue on one network on one type of device doesn't affect all of your base across all the applications you're running. So I think taking more sort of enterprise type connectivity approaches, and how an enterprise would traditionally secure their IT network, putting that into the IoT environment, I think you can really sort of take some good steps taking it forward. And I think the other aspect that we're working certainly on is the zero trust side. looking at how we can provide credentials from the SIM card using the SIM as a very secure mechanism, because the SIM is very much a protected device and that's in our control. So using that to extend into the device realm, and then using that on the platform side, you're really trying to link the two elements together. And I think that's probably an important point to look at from an enterprise, particularly as you start scaling things out. You don't want to be managing passwords. You really want to automate that as much as possible.
Thank you, Alistair. I'm going to stay with this topic just for a couple more minutes because it's really a far-reaching and quite fascinating area. And I want to go back to Niall, and I'd just like you to pick up a few issues around the device itself. We've kind of heard that devices can be very simple. They can be sensors, etc., or they can be very sophisticated and mission critical. And we hear the horror stories that they can be shipped with default passwords that are easy to hack. They have a large surface area of attack. So I'd like to get your perspective, Niall, on what you see in particular vulnerabilities around the device.
Well, around the device, I think the vulnerability itself is that the device is capable of sending malicious data back into the application stack, back up towards where it's supposed to be dealing with it. So when you're talking about securing the actual device, to go on to what Alistair was saying, it's actually the identity of the device is probably one of the most key points. So if you're fundamentally building out a new application or securing something, it's all about the trust. You have to trust the data that's coming from these devices and trust that you understand what that device is doing. So previously, many generations, like devices are just identified as an IP address that might be part of a subnet of IP addresses. They may not know specifically what that IP address is doing, why it's sending too much data, too little data, to the wrong port, over the wrong protocol. It's quite difficult to understand that. When Alistair was saying using the SIM as a root of trust is a key. It's a very good thing. We also do that for our customers because it's a physical element that can have the key stored onto it. It's nearly tamper-proof, sorry. And using that to store the keys, store the identity of the device that can be used when it's communicating and accessing to the application, allows you to trust that it's who it is, essentially. Gaining that visibility into the sort of attack surface is very key, because if there's millions of devices out there and you broadly don't know what they're doing or what their identities are, that is the overwhelming challenge of it. And then allowing you to then move into that at-risk device space. How do you manage devices that are supposed to look like they're performing incorrectly, or they're at risk of a vulnerability attack? And that's when you start to look at this, the concept of zero trust network architecture, so that you can never trust things that are, you start with no trust at the device, basically. But having products and capabilities that allow you to have the flexibility to manage and change the identity, change the firmware, change the application code, allows you to react to these situations moving forwards. So from a connectivity standpoint, you have the SIM and then the ability to re-provision the SIM card over the air with like an eSIM profile. So you can change the identity, change the MISDN, change the profile it's on. But then from a device perspective, the ability to do exactly the same, but with firmware over the air. And that would allow you to change all of the actual application code, the firmware of the device, and then how it's communicating back. This flexibility kind of comes into the mitigation of in-life attacks. So if something comes out and says, hey, there's a secure vulnerability with the client on the device, you're able to go and then reactively change that and download the firmware again and update the device remotely. So that flexibility is something that we kind of always push towards our customers, so that when they're asking about vulnerabilities on the device in terms of the hardware vendors that they may have picked, the specific licenses of bits of software that they may be using, or the actual application code, who built it, how it was built, what software development lifecycle processes were in place when the vendors were building it, to try and really give the understanding that when they're up and running and deploying it, they still have the ability to manage it and enforce more security on the device later on in this device lifecycle.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, I mean, the identity of things, or certainly the issues associated with identity and access management, is a huge topic in itself. We could probably spend an entire session just exploring those issues. But good you raise those, and looking at issues like zero-touch onboarding in the future and how secure that will need to be. I'm going to shift to a different area now, and it's we've kind of looked at the threats. I'd like to kind of understand the implications of an IoT security breach on an enterprise. Just what does it look like? Why does it matter? And I think to Dawood first on that question.
Oh, IoT security breach. I suppose it comes back to something like zero trust. If you look at that concept, by default you just trust nothing. Okay, but at the end of the day, like, if you trust nothing, are you going to be able to do any business? It needs to have some kind of access. So I think that one of the key things here is it's all about control. Ultimate fine-grained control of what we're able to allow our connectivity. So it might be in the user plane. What can we specifically control there? On the SIM card itself, or sorry, the connectivity device itself. What can we control there? Can we limit the amount of data if it's something like a stolen SIM card, and it starts streaming video instead of just measuring a water meter, etc. So all of that comes back to, is your connectivity provider able to provide a degree of control onto your devices, literally to the nth degree.
Thank you. Some of the issues that kind of spring to mind are issues that we see in other types of IT breaches: financial consequences, loss of reputation, potentially legal consequences. I'll bring in Alistair now and give us the benefit of your experience on what the implications of an IoT breach are on the enterprise.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question actually, Andrew. I mean, I think the way we've seen connectivity in the past, and it's security is very much like like insurance. It's only until you've had an issue that maybe you start looking a bit more closely at it. And I think really from an IT perspective, we're still at very much the infancy of it. And I think as we go forward, security is going to become more and more important, because these devices that have been deployed aren't necessarily always future-proofed with that in mind. And I think that's the fundamental concern from an enterprise is, how can you now fix that problem that maybe is a ticking time bomb? And I think, like you say, from the enterprise perspective, there are so many issues that they would face, whether it's reputation or perhaps losing money, or perhaps from a regulatory point of view, they can't comply. There are a lot of issues that they perhaps may not face today, they could face tomorrow, because it is a changing landscape. And I think it's just building all the armory into their solution to make sure that they've got the capability to respond. So certainly from our perspective, it's starting with the building blocks, from the solution from the outset, and having right control over it is the key part, because you're not necessarily deploying a device for a very short period. Some of these devices could be in the field 5-10 years, and how can you predict what's going to be happening in the future? So you've really got to have the right tools to be able to manage that over time, and to secure it as much as you can.
Thank you, Alistair. I'll bring in Nassia now and give us your view on the implications of an IoT security breach and what it can mean for an enterprise.
Right. So we're going to see the implications in two different areas. One is the financial impact and the operational impact it will have in the organization itself. And the other is the personal, which is security, privacy, perhaps loss of life, hopefully not, but it could, if it's a stalker after somebody that could gain access to a device and find out what that person is. So the implication can be both on the personal level and the operational and organizational level. And then there is a fine question and a fine line between them too. Is like, if you have to choose, what do you secure? Do you prioritize security and privacy to ensure your consumers are safe, or do you prioritize the operations and the devices and the system to ensure you don't have the breach in the beginning? So what is more important and what doesn't make more sense? And do we go with the financial side to begin with, which is like, it's going to cost us a little bit more in order to ensure that the security is there in the different levels? Or are we going to try to secure as we go along, as we find out, what is happening? As I mentioned earlier, we don't know what we don't know. So it is a conversation that needs to happen early on. It needs to happen by design, and also the appropriate investment needs to be applied in order to ensure that security is there, because the financial implications for an organization, they're going to be there no matter what. They're going to be there because you need to spend a little bit more money in order to secure both the infrastructure and the devices and the applications. And they would be there for sure if something, God forbid, happens, that you will need to take action afterwards. So the implications could be vast and devastating if we don't pay attention. That said, it's not all doom and gloom, because the information and the advantages that we get from IoT services and IoT connectivity are so big, and they provide so many benefits that with the appropriate intervention early on the design phase of the applications, we can reap the results without having to worry as much and not lose the trust, because at the moment we are in a phase where the consumer themselves, they are not trusting the applications, they do not trust the IoT products because of everything that's been happening. So a lot more evangelizing needs to go out there, a lot more educating needs to be, to get out there, so people can understand that they can have a secure IoT product if they follow certain guidelines and make sure that what they buy, it's actually secure from the beginning, from its inception, from the design stages.
So very important to have secured by design, which is the title of this session. I'm just going to bring Niall in now for the last few comments. We talked about financial loss, business confidence, but some of the high security applications that you mentioned earlier, I mean, it could be the connected car where hacking of a vehicle system is potentially lethal. I wonder if you've got a perspective on particular security breaches that could be very hard-hitting.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of security breaches and that have been quite public around unsecured devices, like Mirai large botnets that come around that are taking advantage of things like video cameras that have not been connected and not been secured, essentially from their access perspective. When you go into the high security sort of events, you're really looking at potential loss of life if something is is hacked, and you're looking at connected car where you're able to potentially change the attributes within the car modules itself, that you can maybe lower the braking capabilities or change the firmware or change even the mapping system so you can direct people the wrong way. All these capabilities are when you look at the high security side of it. I think one of the key sides is that within many different countries of operation, there's different penalties for what will happen here. So if something bad goes wrong, you look at all the different layers within the solution and the product that was capable there. So if you say it's a connected car, who is at fault? Was it the SIM provider? Was it the module provider? Was it the person who provided the application code or the device management system? Or was it the cloud provider? All these different people that are involved in these solutions have to be fully aware that they're selling into a high security, highly regulated sector, that they have to meet all of the checks and balances to operate in that fashion. And depending on the country, there may actually be something like corporate manslaughter for something going wrong, that it actually can go right up to people being taken into jail because of a loss of life scenario. So the high security verticals are quite traditionally the most expensive verticals to sell into, and also for the solutions that are buying in there because of all this extra compliance. You see something like the connected car industry adopting eSIM from a connectivity standpoint very aggressively, very early on, and that's because they have the investment for the high value asset to protect and secure the connectivity. So they really drove that adoption of eSIM very early on. And now you see something like smaller IoT devices being able to get that benefit, later, 5-10 years after the event.
Thank you. I'm just going to bring Dawood back in while we're staying on this topic, and to talk about particular regulatory aspects that are happening at the moment. So what are governments doing in terms of regulating IoT?
Yeah, I suppose just before we go, I just want to, bring your attention to the regulatory environment. I think it's important to note that, Secure by Design, is a UK government initiative. It's something that they started last year. I think they just published the paper on it just in April. But what we need to actually be aware of is that if we don't address these security issues, as they kind of appear, or preempt them, what we might end up with is a scenario whereby IoT devices come under a lot more scrutiny. And that has some issues for us as an industry or the ecosystem, because IoT is something that ultimately is here to drive down cost and make things more efficient. However, if our devices require certification or approval, etc., that's going to increase the cost. And if that happens, it will hinder some of the applications that we're going to be able to do. I suppose the other thing is that if the regulatory environment does become a little bit more complex in IoT as well, what will happen then is that innovation could get stifled as well. And if that innovation is stifled, then we might have again another contraction in what could be and damage our very high growth trajectory.
Thank you for that, Dawood. I'm going to shift the focus around a little bit, and it wouldn't be a session without mentioning COVID. So I'd like to ask Alistair, first of all, how do you see that COVID has really had an impact on the IoT security environment, and what is security going to look like in a post-COVID world?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean that's the thing at the moment. Certainly, COVID has had an impact on cybersecurity generally. I think from an enterprise perspective, the fact that a lot of people are home working, perhaps they're using computers which aren't as managed and secured by the enterprise as they have been previously. It's really sort of opened up the attack service for how many devices are on the network, and particularly those unsecure devices which may be accessing the corporate network. So I think really from that perspective, it's opened up a lot more interest from unwanted attackers to compromise devices or perhaps target particular enterprises. Certainly from our partners and research they've done, they've seen a lot more focus on perhaps healthcare, for instance, whether it's people involved in the COVID supply chain, or perhaps just enterprises or healthcare providers using IoT connectivity as part of their offerings, and also the manufacturing sector as well. So I think that's probably just what's happened in the last year is probably just a sample of what's going to be happening in the future. And as we've seen, cybersecurity, the topic doesn't go away. It's just going to come back with bigger and bigger impacts. So I think really, as we've talked about today, now's the time to really sort of focus back and just circle back around and just look at exactly what's going on the network. And some of the things we talked about today, even like the regulation from the governments, they're not hard to follow. They're offering some good advice, and I think really sort of structuring IT security around that is certainly the strong message we would give. To ask those questions and to not take complacency about the solution that you're providing.
Yeah, of course, COVID is just part of the new threat landscape. We've only got a few minutes left. Time has absolutely flown by today, and I've got so many more questions I wanted to ask you before this session comes to an end. So I'm going to go to Nassia now and ask you what can we do to actually improve collaboration, certification, standardization in the IoT ecosystem?
Okay, if I may, I want to add something that I think it's important before we run out of time, really. And that is when we're looking at the security and securing IoT, we really need to look at what we currently have. And I'm talking about the enterprise side of things. An enterprise, they need to understand where the holes are in security in the existing systems, in an existing network, because there's a lot of legacy systems and hardware out there that are not secure. And if you try to build something that even if it's secure, it's just not going to work. So it's extremely important that we start. The first step is that we start from looking what we have, how can we secure and make sure what we have is secure before we add anything on top of that. Now, to go back to your question, what we can do, I think one of the simple things is, sessions like this, sessions on collaboration and talking with each other and discussing what the issues are and how can we best solve those issues, because each person, controls or holds a little bit of piece of that whole ecosystem puzzle. So if we can understand the challenges around each area of the entire ecosystem and how we can work together to collaborate and come to a consensus and come to an understanding of what are the things that we need to do, it would help bring us to the next level. Already, Dawood mentioned about regulations and also the important thing about not stifling innovation through regulation. That's why I think collaboration through the ecosystem and the ecosystem players, it will be the key going forward in order to ensure that innovation stays and continues. It is what I would like to call a calculated risk. The risk is there. There are steps we can take on a daily basis as organizations, as service providers, as enterprises to ensure that we minimize that risk. That is from ensuring the end-to-end encryption and making sure that we comply with the different regulations, and ensuring that the devices that we're putting into our network are secure. And, to close this is build security from the design, from the ground up.
Well, thank you. Thank you to you all. As I said, I've got a lot more questions, and we certainly had a lot more discussion points when we were getting this session together. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank you all. So thank you, Dawood, thank you, Niall, thank you, Alistair, and thank you, Nassia. It's been a fantastic discussion, and yeah, I think we could have spent the whole afternoon on it. So thank you to you all, and goodbye.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.